I'll just keep it brief. I'll just give an introduction for 15 minutes, and because I have to go to another meeting at 6, and so I want to leave time for discussion. So I will not talk for more than 15 minutes, so I hope that will be bearable. The reason I want to talk about food reserves is twofold, and the reason I'm involved in this NGO Action for Food Reserves is twofold. One is something I'm sure we can all agree about, concern about malnutrition, and concern about the fact that this has been something that has been talked about for decades and decades and decades, if not centuries and centuries and centuries. And there have been moments of confidence that lack of food will be solved. I can remember when I was young, 1,000,000 years ago, there were people who were saying that scientific development was bound to find the cure to this problem. But then a decade later, you had very terrible famines in parts of the world. It galvanized a lot of concern. Everybody knows about Live Aid and so on. But even so, decades on, this remains a problem. And however scientifically sophisticated we get, it seems to be insoluble, or at least very hard to solve. So that's one reason. This small organization I belong to does not have the solution to a problem that people have not been able to solve for decades and decades. But it does have a way of dealing with one aspect of the problem that I think is interesting and which does relate to issues of, cultural diplomacy. Our organization, first of all, is only looking at a small aspect of the problem. It's looking at acute malnutrition rather than chronic malnutrition. It's not looking at the problem of chronic malnutrition, which is essentially a product of poverty and which affects millions of, if not billions of people. That is not what we're looking at. What we're looking at is acute malnutrition. That is to say, horrific problems that can occur very quickly when there's a spike in the price of food. And that's what we've tried to address. And that's what our program is looking at trying to deal with. And the system which we have sought to promote, and we're not unique in this, although there are some who say it doesn't work, but if I'm going to bypass that for the moment, that's an excuse you get when you've only got 15 minutes. But the approach we have is based on the idea of setting up food reserves. And the basis of this, or behind this, is the fact that we are an organization that believes that you do have a market economy, you do have a law of supply and demand, that you can't deal with this problem by sweeping that market economy aside. It doesn't work to have a system of rationing. It doesn't work to have a system of price controls. These things get bogged down in impossible procedural difficulties. We will use the law of supply and demand, but we know that when there is, for instance, a severe harvest failure, that when, therefore, the supply of food goes down severely 1 year, that if there are reserves available, then those reserves can be put onto the market, and if those reserves go onto the market, the supply increases, and the price, therefore, comes down simply according to the laws of supply and demand. So we work with the market economy, but we tweak it with reserves that we have available when the need arises. So that's the first aspect, and that's, if you like, the first 5 minutes. It's a system of food reserves. But the second aspect of this is that it is a regional food reserve. It is not a national food reserve. We want a system whereby a food reserve operates across national boundaries, where several different countries are brought together. We've had discussions with some of them here in Brussels. We've been to this representation of Macedonia, we've been to the representation of Ecuador, we've been to the representation of Bolivia, we've been to the representation of Peru, we've talked to the representation from Bolivia, those four countries that, Colombia, sorry, those 4 countries are part of the Andean Pact. We've talked to other countries as well. We would like to have a regional food reserve involving several countries. It may or may not be part of an existing or related to an existing organization. There's an alphabet soup of regional groupings out there, like the Andean group or Mercosur, or and that's just South America. I mean, we're looking at a regional grouping. And there are very practical reasons for that in terms of the advantage of regional reserves, because problems may arise in one country that are not so severe in another country. And so there are obvious benefits in terms of the cost if you are operating at a regional rather than a national level. But of course, once you are involving different nation states whose relations may not always be perfect, that may involve a lot of rivalry, you are bringing them together for a practical purpose, but there are always cultural, diplomatic issues involved. So it's a regional reserve. The third aspect, perhaps the most controversial aspect, so I leave my last 7 minutes for that. We propose that it is organized according to what we call the community method. What you might call, very much with inverted commas, the EU method. Now, what lies behind that is a view that the EU system, which, textbooks fill up with describing this in terms of partial sharing of sovereignty, supranationalism, intergovernmental, you can fall asleep reading the textbooks. But what this system does involve is one which has worked very well in Europe, I would say, since the Second World War. After all, what are we in Europe, those of us who are from Europe, but a group of tribal and warring countries bunched into the western peninsula of Asia, addicted to conflict? That certainly seemed like what we were in 1945. Something had to be done about this. It was no good promising to love one another once again. There had to be institutions, structures. I'm not saying an institution can ever abolish warfare, but it can make it a little more difficult to get out of bed for. And therefore, it was in Europe that this sovereignty sharing system, partial sovereignty sharing system, emerged through the coal and steel community and then 6 treaties later that slowly drew in other countries, not because Europe was superior to any other part of the world. Certainly not. Not because everyone was busy reading Kant's Perpetual Peace and thinking, oh yes, let's implement that. But actually, in many ways, because Europe had been inferior to other parts of the world in the way that it had fought or brought the whole world into 2 devastating and catastrophic world wars. It developed this system, which, for reasons you'll be familiar with as an Institute for Culture and Diplomacy, I hate to call the European system. It's a system that emerged in Europe because Europe needed something and it stumbled upon it, perhaps, if that's not unfair to Jean Monnet. But whether it stumbled upon it or developed it, it's benefited from it. And we would like to see that system elsewhere in the world, not because it's European and therefore better, but because we feel it's worked for us, we needed it, maybe it has a place elsewhere. And so built into our proposal for a food reserve, a regional food reserve, is a suggestion of a structure of that reserve which in many ways is similar to the structure within the European Union. In other words, the reserves would not be the property of a particular nation state. If it was the Andean group, Colombia or Bolivia or Ecuador or Peru, it would be the property of the community. And the community of which those 4 countries would be members in the way that members of the European Union are the nation states as separate members. It would be administered by the community. And it would be the community that would be responsible for key decisions such as to release reserves because it had accepted that the price of a particular commodity was getting too high in a particular member state. And that's our system. But of course, cultural diplomacy is so important here. You go to the Bolivian representation, you go to the Ecuador representation, you go to the Peruvian representation. You know they're very different in many respects. You know they have political differences. You know, Peru, Colombia, they have separate bilateral trade deals with the US and with the EU. Bolivia, Ecuador don't like that idea. There's all sorts of things. They also would say, look, this idea of a food reserve, don't bring it to us as something that is from some sort of superior EU idea. We used to have this sort of, back in the time of the Incas, they had the idea of food reserves. So don't come to this with some, and don't talk about some sort of superior EU method. I mean, you have to learn very much that this is something that needs to develop out of and be responsible and responsive to local conditions. But we do think that this is a much more effective system for avoiding the waste and corruption which so often inhibits development in many parts of the world. So it's a combination. It's a belief that food reserves work as a way for dealing with acute malnutrition. It's a belief that the community method is the best way of administering those reserves. That's what we've been talking to various representations about. That's what we've also talked to various MEPs about. We want to have a pilot project. We're trying to persuade the Parliament and the Commission this would be a good idea. And that's where we are. It's work in progress. And that's 15 minutes. Okay, so I'll shut up. if there was a crisis, there would be access to food that was stored locally. Because often the problem is that you might be trying to get something from thousands of miles away, from perhaps a warehouse in Chicago or something from international aid, and that takes an awful lot of time to arrive. You are right that there is a cost of storage, and there would be a cost of setting this system up. So it does cost money to set up. The good thing about it, we think, is that although it costs money to set up, it doesn't cost too much to maintain. Of course, there is storage and replacement, but our idea is that we release what the community would release. If there was a problem in a particular country, it would release reserves. Those reserves would then be sold on the market. They wouldn't, it's not given away as food aid. They would be sold on the market, and by increasing supply, it would bring the price down. They would be sold by a particular national government. The money it raised would then be used to buy the same food in order to replenish the reserves, and it would buy when they were at a lower price than when they sold it. So, you know, this makes it sound rather sort of like horrible capitalists as ever, but I mean, you know, what you're actually doing is you're not giving food away, you are acting in such a way as to prevent too much price volatility. And so, although of course you'll have constant costs of storage and administration, the individual member state would be required to sell the food and then buy it to replenish the reserves, and the money would always be part of the community. And so we don't think that it would cost a lot to maintain it. And we'd even argue that if for instance, although this is a little bit of another issue, but if the money to get it going came from, for instance, part of the development aid fund of the EU, that actually it wouldn't take very much of that budget to set something up that could be very effective. And if it has this method of administering it, there'd be much less of a chance of it being falling prey to corruption, because this would be a system of, this would be the community method, which I don't want to call the EU method.
Thank you.
Thank you.